January 17, 2436. Sector 6, European District, Bazaar City.
Hard Reset Redux is a brand new version of the cyberpunk classic that includes all of the content of the previous edition and adds new improved gameplay, enhanced visuals, and additional content to make this the definitive edition of Hard Reset. Well, that's all according to the Steam store page anyway. Now, I'll give credit where it's due, this is the definitive version of Hard Reset. It has improved performance and tweaked difficulty modes, but brand new version, well, that's really up for debate. I recently reviewed Hard Reset Extended Edition, so if you want to know all the ins and outs of the original game, then go check out that video. This video is really just going to take a look at the new features and improvements that have been included in the Redux Edition. All things considered though, this really is the same as Hard Reset Extended with just a few modifications to the base gameplay. It's still largely the same from start to finish, and if you weren't a fan of the original game, then chances are there's not much that's going to win you over. And even if you were a bit of a fan, then there's not really all that much new in the Redux Edition to warrant a second purchase. Don't worry though, because I'm going to tell you why. In fact, I'd actually like to address all of the so-called new features one by one, and see how they change the game for better or worse. We can read through all of them together like a big group activity, so go to the Steam store page, scroll down to the new features section, and let's go through them together, shall we? Okay, so the first new addition is the brand new Cyber Katana. Now this thing sounds like a lightsaber when you swing it, and it looks like the sword from Shadow Warrior. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if it's the same weapon model, just reskinned. It wouldn't be too hard to do considering both games run on the same engine. Anyway, the Katana is just a simple melee weapon with a light and heavy attack. The only enemy type it's really all that good against is the most basic robot enemies. Though the problem here is that the basic robots are often bundled in with some of the exploding suicide type enemies as well, and you don't really want to be too close to those things when they detonate. The other issue is that you have to cycle through the Katana when swapping weapons. Now in the original game you could press Q by default to quickly swap to either the NRG weapon or the CLN rifle. But now it has to cycle through the Katana as well, which makes switching weapons a little bit more cumbersome. You can press F1 or F2 to select each weapon respectively, but it's a lot further to reach than the Q button. I'll admit this is more of a subjective fault, but still it's something I noticed. Overall, the Katana isn't really that effective and I barely even used it. There's no real need to use it to conserve ammo or anything, as ammo pickups are abundant and it regenerates your ammunition automatically anyway. Next we've got the brand new enemy type, the Cyborg Zombie. Now there's nothing much to say here, these are just zombies that you encounter every now and then, which are added into the original lineup of enemy types. They're not very creative and they die pretty easily, in fact they're one of the only other enemy types that the Katana is half useful on. The next new addition is the dash move. Now this is something I can get behind. Again, this has been taken right out of Shadow Warrior, but it does have a pretty big effect on the gameplay in Hard Reset. It can be used to get out of a hot spot quickly and is pretty useful against some of the bigger enemies that launch more damaging projectiles. You also take less damage during the boss fights as you can distance yourself from the radius of some of their explosive attacks. All in all, I think this is a pretty good change and one of the objectively improved mechanics of the Redux Edition. Moving on, we've got the so-called enhanced visuals. Now take it from someone who just came from playing the original game, I don't see that much of a change in the visuals. Don't get me wrong, it's still a really good looking game. I mean, the lighting is amazing, the texture work is sharp and crisp, and the animations are fluid. Apparently it runs on the latest version of the Roadhog engine, but just what these changes are is kind of beyond me. Like I said, it looks the same as the original version, and if there is something modified visually, it's barely noticeable. On the same note, there's also improved performance. Now, again, the original game could run on a goddamn toaster if it had to. The loading times are supposedly improved, and I guess they might be like 5 or 6 seconds faster, but they're covered by cinematics anyway, so chances are you're not going to really care all that much how long it takes, because it's not like you're staring at a blank progress bar or anything. And again, like the visuals, if there is a change here with the performance, it's minimal at absolute best. The next 2 points are easily the biggest game changers, quite literally, and that's the rebalanced gameplay and different enemy placements. Now, the balancing in the original game was a huge issue. The game was often just simply unfair, and would just throw an insane amount of bullet sponge enemies at the player, often in confined environments with bugger all room to move around. The basic robots had far too many health points considering the amount of them you'd have to fight at once, and you took some serious damage from certain attacks that just felt like it was more damaging than it really should be. The first thing I noticed when playing the Redux edition is that the normal difficulty setting actually feels like a normal difficulty setting. The health points for the more abundant robot enemies seems to have been reduced, which was a huge problem in the original game. Now there's the right amount of challenge without things being too much of a cakewalk, and I could definitely see myself actually wanting to finish this game on the higher difficulties. Enemies are still annoying as piss, but the amount of damage I found myself taking during combat was far less, and I didn't find myself getting cheaped out during the more chaotic combat areas. This was a huge dilemma in the original game, as I said, and you can genuinely see some improvements in the way combat plays out, which is a massive change. The other side of this is the enemy placements. Now, I'm not too sure just how different this is. I don't have an eidetic memory of all the enemy encounters in the first game, but I do know that a few of the enemies you encountered later on originally now show up in the earlier levels, which I guess is to give you more of a gradual introduction onto how they behave, instead of throwing you right into the goddamn deep end. So finally, if I'm being entirely honest about the whole thing, I really don't think there's all that much new stuff here. Don't get me wrong, the game has definitely been improved, but I think it's pretty obvious it's only been slapped together to be sold off to people on the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4. I mean, Techland has done the same thing with the release of Dead Island Definitive Edition. I would recommend this to people who've never played the game before because, as I said earlier on, it's really the definitive version of Hard Reset. But if you play the original and think this is going to be some kind of super improved version of that game, then you might be a little bit underwhelmed with the overall product. We're at this weird kind of renaissance with shooting games at the moment, where a lot of these more old school style shooters are making a bit of a return, so they've definitely released this at the right time, and I doubt it's a coincidence that the release happens to almost coincide with Doom 2016 either. But this isn't going to win you over if you weren't a fan of the original game, and the modifications aren't going to suddenly have you screaming your love from the top of a mountain anytime soon. First timers might get a bit of a kick out of it, everyone else though, just stick with what you're doing.